Welcome, everybody. This is VMware Cloud on AWS Expert-Led Workshop, Hands-on Labs number 198702. And this workshop is brought to you by the VMware Cloud on AWS Solution Engineering Team. My name is Roberto Canton. I'm part of that group in the United States. I reside in Florida. I got a bunch of my team members here, Jennifer Schmidt, Andrea Severo. Those are the captains that were responsible for creating the lab. I also have Kerry Holton and Mark Mullemans and Randy Carson that just stepped out. Those are part of my team members in the US. So thanks to all of them and a bunch of other folks that are not here. This lab was put together. So thanks to all of them. If you guys are playing the cloud credibility play, the key word for this lab to enter into that is connectivity. So make sure you take a note of that, or you can scan this. I can put it back at the end if you guys want. But connectivity is the key word to receive credit for this lab. All right, so from an agenda perspective, what we're gonna do, we already went through the introductions. I'm gonna talk a little bit about how the lab was constructed and also what the lab experience is gonna be. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna leave kind of like a little bit of time to just go through a small overview of what VMware Cloud on AWS is, for those of you that are relatively new to the service and would like to understand it a little better. And then all of us here together, we're gonna assist you as you guys go through the actual exercises of the labs. If there's any questions, just raise your hand, bring us over, we can talk about it. If it's something that you guys think that might be worth a larger discussion with a larger group, we can actually do that. We have a whiteboard here that we can whiteboard certain solutions for you if that's what you guys like. I would like to just let you know, please take advantage of the amount of knowledge that's in this room right now. Any of us can assist you probably with any of the questions that you may have. And if there is something that we cannot answer for you, we can always take your name and email address and have a follow-up discussion with you guys. All right, so I introduced Jennifer and Andrea. They are the captains for VMware Cloud on AWS Lab 198701. There's two versions of this lab. There's a 198701 version, which is basically the self-paced lab. And then this is this 198702, which is the expert-led workshop. The difference between the two of them is basically two things. One is the self-run lab that you take outside in the floor is basically what we call almost a simulation of the service. In other words, we're not actually standing up real infrastructure. We actually have some recordings that are used in that lab so that you guys can go through it. And the reason for that is, and we're going to explain, I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail, is in order to stand up an environment in VMware Cloud on AWS, we need an advance notice of 2 hours. So 2 hours before you guys came in here to sit down and take this expert-led workshop, we actually kicked off the build of the infrastructure that you guys are going to run on. So in this particular lab that you guys are going to experience today, you guys are going to actually be using real infrastructure from AWS, right? The one outside does not use real infrastructure. It's more of a simulation type thing. And the reason for that is because if you come in and sit down, you're not going to be waiting there for 2 hours, waiting for the environment to build. And unfortunately, that's how long it takes, right? The second big difference is we just last week announced our latest release of VMware Cloud on AWS. In VMware Cloud on AWS, we have release cycles every 90 days. And last week, we announced the latest release cycle, which includes the NSXT capability within VMware Cloud on AWS that is now going to allow you to do things like micro-segmentation within VMware Cloud on AWS. The lab that's outside is not NSXT based, so the NSX version that is running on the other lab is very basic functions, like I need to open a firewall port 80 for my web server. I need to create a firewall rule to either deny or allow traffic from the internet, those kind of things. But in this exercise, part of this exercise is that you guys are going to go through, we do have the capability of doing things like micro-segmentation from NSX, okay? I didn't say a fun fact about myself. I guess the only fun fact about myself here in Barcelona is that I've been eating a lot of ham, and I love ham. And there's a big joke around our group right now of everybody eating ham. So All right, so how was the lab constructed? So again, like I explained to you, we're basically running on one node, what we call a one node SDDC. I hate to call it a cluster because a one node is not a cluster. You need at least two nodes to run a cluster, but it's basically a one node software defined data center running on the AWS cloud. And there is actually a scan code in your manual. I think it's at the end of every module where you can scan it, and there's a special promotion that you guys can run a one node for 30 days relatively cheaply. So if you're interested in doing that, just to kind of like test out the service and see what it's all about, you're more than welcome to do that as well, right? We actually built some automation. My team uses a lot of different automation tools, and one of them is Slack, right? So Slack, we use it to intercommunicate within the group. We actually have a robot within Slack that we call Bender, where we actually create, I can actually, from my phone or from my computer, I can go ahead and create automation that builds all my SDDCs at once. For the Las Vegas VM world, we had a bigger rooms than we have here, so we are able to create basically up to 15 SDDCs on the fly by me issuing just one command from my phone, right? So very quickly we can stand up infrastructure, very quickly we can stand up, as soon as you guys leave, for example, where you're gonna leave out of here, we're gonna send our automation bot a message saying, go ahead and destroy all the environments that you guys worked on, and they'll be destroyed immediately. So that kind of automation is built. We have a full set of APIs for VMware Cloud on AWS. There's an API module in this lab as well that you guys can take advantage of. Outside, the lab that you take outside is kind of like an interactive simulation where you guys are not actually going through like the vCenter interface, for example, live. It's just a recording. In here, you're actually going to be running on a live vCenter instance, and you're actually going to be doing a lot of vCenter activities. And one response that I had from VMware Las Vegas, somebody raised their hand and it's like, I don't understand. This lab is not really teaching me anything because all I'm doing is creating VMs and cloning VMs. This is what I do on an everyday basis. I expected to come here and actually learn something new. And I'm like, that's exactly the point that we want to come across to you, is that running an SDDC and VMware Cloud on AWS is nothing, very much almost nothing different than what you do on an everyday-to-day basis, right? So some of those exercises may sound boring, but they got a meaning to it. It's for you to understand that creating a VM, cloning a VM, attaching it to a network, or different things like that are basically the same thing that you do on an everyday basis on premises, okay? I mentioned that we have a developer center and API. There's a lot of useful examples there, great examples, so you guys can try that. We also have integration with Native Aws Services. So if you're already an AWS customer and you're taking advantage of things like RDS, a relational database service, or perhaps you have S3 buckets where you put your backups or different things like that, we have in the module that we have for Native Aws integration, we have I believe there's one for how do you build how do you put all your your templates, your VMware templates in an S3 bucket and have a content library running directly from vCenter pointing to that S3 bucket. And then the other exercise I believe is on relational database service. So actually having a relational database service on the AWS side that actually has no direct interaction with the internet, and then putting the rest of the part of the application on VMware Cloud on AWS and interacting with the RDS instance that is running on the other side. So we have quite a few good examples there. As far as what the lab is concerned, from a module perspective, the module 1 is basically working with your SDDCs. So I mentioned to you guys, we've already created the SDDCs for you because as much as we would like to show you how to do that and you guys go through that exercise, it takes a couple of hours to get that, that initial SDDC up and running. But you're going to be basically working with the HTML5 user interface, which is the VMware Cloud on AWS portal. And also, you're going to do a lot of common tasks from a vCenter perspective, an SDDC perspective. We're going to have you create a few firewall rules so that vCenter can be accessible from the internet, for example. And then you're going to go into a module for what Developer Center within the portal is all about, as well as the APIs that you can basically utilize to take advantage and automate a lot of the stuff, just like we have automated in order to create this lab. And then the last module is the integration with native AWS services. Like I said, we're integrating a content library that has a whole bunch of VM templates that is basically stored in an S3 bucket directly into vCenter, as well as an application interacting with the AWS relational database service. The end result, in other words, at the end of the day of the application that we're going to demonstrate at that AWS module, right here you can see a depiction of what this all looks about, right? So on the left-hand side is you guys, the users. You guys are going to open certain firewall ports so that you can access from the internet, you can access that instance that is running on VMware Cloud and AWS, which is the application, which in the back end is basically using a MySQL database that is running on that relational database service from Amazon, right? So this is all interconnected, and it'll make a little bit more sense when I go through the overview of what the service is all about. All right, any questions up until now? I'm gonna get now into what the overview of the service is, right? So what is VMware Cloud on AWS, right? So one of the things that we try to offer with this service is all of the capabilities of our SDDC technologies, our software-defined data center technologies, delivered as a cloud service on the AWS cloud, right? So we got that elasticity factor from a cloud perspective, from an AWS perspective, but also we want to give you the consistency and the familiarity of the VMware technologies that you're accustomed to using. So if you're a VMware admin today, you know how to use vCenter, you know how to create a VM, you know how to upload a template, you know how to export a VM into an OVF. Those kind of things, we wanted to make sure that we didn't deviate much on a from the activities that you do on a day-to-day basis, and keep it very consistent with what you normally do. But one of the things that we find out as we talk to different customers that want to go and leverage the public cloud is how difficult it is for them to migrate machines that are running on premises into the cloud, or to convert those machines that are running on premises into the cloud. So one of the things that we strive to do with this service is give you the easy workload portability of those VMs into this service, right? But it's not just moving them to the cloud, but also how can I migrate them from the cloud back on-prem? And you can do both of those activities with different technologies that we use to support the service as well. And where the service really comes in full circle is not only the proximity, but also the accessibility of all the native AWS services, right? So whether you're using Lambda to automate some functions, RDS, S3, maybe you want to take a traditional 3-tier application where you have the web tier, the app tier, the database tier, you want to migrate it to VMware Cloud on AWS, but then you want to take that web tier and put it in an EC2 instance in an auto-scaling group, so that it can grow and shrink as the demand warrants. Now if you really think about what I'm talking about here, you almost always transform that traditional 3-tier application into almost a cloud-native application, because that elasticity factor, you may only need it from that web tier perspective. So those kind of things is what you can do with this service in combination with the native AWS services. And that's just a few examples of that, right? But we're also expanding the service so that if you want to create new apps, like container-based apps, and VMs or VMs, or a combination of those, you can also take advantage of the service to do that. And there were a lot of exciting announcements made today in the keynote session around containers and around Kubernetes, for example. All those kind of services, some of them may already be available for VMware Cloud and AWS consumption. Some of them may not be, but they're in a roadmap for them to be supported. So. Okay, so this is basically what the service is all about. On the left-hand side here, you see your data center, right? So at the very least, you're running vSphere in your data center. Hopefully you're running vCenter to manage your vSphere-based data center from a virtualized perspective. On the right hand, on the middle box, you see the VMware Cloud on AWS, but right underneath it, you see the Aws Global Infrastructure. And what we do is we take bare metal servers from AWS. This is not nested virtualization. AWS makes bare metal servers available to us, VMware, and we, VMware, take our vSphere technology, our vSAN technology, our NSX technology, and deploy it on top of those bare metal servers, right? Once we do that, then the next thing that we do is we expose vCenter to you as a customer, so that you have that familiarity of vCenter, of basically everything that you do from an everyday basis perspective. And you see that double arrow that connects the two vCenters there. What we're doing there is a technology called hyperlink mode. And with hyperlink mode, you can basically connect the two vCenters together so that you can manage both environments, your on-prem environment and the VMware Cloud on AWS environment, directly from the same interface, from the same pane of glass. In other words, I don't have to be jumping from one window to the other. I don't have to have two tabs open in my browser. I can see both environments in the same pane of glass. I can stop, start VMs, delete VMs, create VMs, whether I'm creating them on-prem, whether I'm creating them in the cloud, both from the same interface, right? That's what hyperlink mode gives. On the right-hand side, though, you see all the Amazon Web Services. They have close to 100 plus services from their native AWS services perspective. And you see that double arrow that connects the two environments together? That is what we call an ENI, an Elastic Network Interface. That is an AWS term. And basically what happens is, when we stand up an SDDC in VMware Cloud on AWS, one of the things that we ask from you is, what is your AWS credentials? Your AWS username, your AWS password, right? And we run what is called a CloudFormation template. For those of you that don't know what a CloudFormation template is, just think of it as an automation tool that AWS makes available to you as a customer that basically can do A, B, or C, and that A, B, or C can be a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of different things from, create me an EC2 instance with a database tier and RDS, with this connectivity, and open this firewall port out there. That can be a CloudFormation template. Our CloudFormation template basically goes out and discovers your AWS environment so that we know what your AWS environment looks like, and then we give you a choice of, okay, if you have 10 VPCs for those of you that don't know, are virtual private cloud. It's an AWS term. Just think of it as a logical isolation of resources, so I can have a VPC running 10 EC2 instances, a second VPC running another 10 EC2 instances. Those instances in each of those VPCs don't talk to each other unless I connect the two VPCs together. So I'm logically isolating those resources on the native AWS side. We ask you, okay, which of these VPCs do you want to connect to your VMware Cloud on AWS environment? And the subsequent question is, which subnet within that VPC I can connect to my AWS environment? Once I select that, my SDDC gets deployed in that availability zone from AWS that I select, and that connection is done automatically between my VMware Cloud on AWS environment and the native AWS VPC that I selected. Everything is denied all by default, so I still have some work to do when my SDDC gets created, and that's part of the exercises that you guys are going to do today, so that I can open that communication between the two environments. Once I've done that, the two environments can communicate with each other with no problem, okay? So what are some of the main use cases that we're looking at, right? So from a data center extension perspective, is that maintain what you already have, but expand. So maybe you guys are here in Europe, maybe you guys are looking to set up shop somewhere else, maybe in Asia, maybe in America, anywhere else, South America, different places like that. So you want to grow that capacity that you guys currently have from a Europe perspective, but you may not want to set up a data center in the US, for example, if you want to expand that way, right? You can take advantage of the AWS regions in the United States to basically go ahead and create environments in the United States, and that way it gives you that footprint expansion that you need without necessarily having to spend an arm and a leg trying to open a brand new data center for your company, right? Or perhaps you want to run virtual desktops and publish applications. This is a very common use cases in the US. We have a lot of developers that are overseas, sometimes in India, sometimes in other countries. So if we want to make those virtual desktops a little bit, more or closer to where my applications are, whether those applications are in the US, in Europe, in London, Frankfurt, Japan, anywhere in the world, I can basically do that. But also a very common use case from an extension perspective is test and dev environments, right? How many times does a developer come to you and say, I need a test environment for this much, I need this much resources for a test environment, and you have to tell them, hey, you gotta wait 6 months because we gotta put this through an approval process internally so that we can get the infrastructure purchased before we get the servers delivered, and we can get VMware installed and Vsphere installed and all of that. It probably is gonna be at least a couple of months, maybe even more, before you can get that. What if in a matter of 2 hours you can have that environment available already there? Or what if you already have an environment in the VMware Cloud on AWS cloud, and then all of a sudden you need to grow it a little more, and in a matter of minutes you can grow that environment as well. Also, disaster recovery. So whether you want to protect your current disaster recovery environment or you want to replace an existing disaster recovery environment, you can also do that. It can also serve well as a complement to your existing DR service. This is something that we see, the cloud migrations, right? You want to get out of the data center business. You don't want to run a data center anymore. But you don't want to go through the pain of converting all your VMs that you're running on a vSphere environment into what a native cloud would be. We can give you the tools to very easily migrate those applications out of your data center. So it could be a data center evacuation type thing. Or perhaps you just need a temporary place, whether you've done a merger or an acquisition type scenario, or you actually need a temporary place to because you're going to do an infrastructure refresh. So you got to vacate your data center maybe for a couple of months, do an infrastructure refresh, then bring those machines back. VMware Cloud on AWS would be perfect for that. And again, if you're also in the path of doing kind of like next generation apps, or perhaps you want to modernize all of your applications and you want to get closer to where all of those services are, VMware Cloud on AWS environment is a great place for that. I've already talked about around cloud migrations, data center expansion, and disaster recovery, so I'm not going to expand on that. But where are we today? Where do we operate from, right? So today, as you can see in the little block dots there, in the US, we're in the West Oregon region. In the East, we're in the Virginia region. We are also in the UK. We are also in Frankfurt. We just opened shop in Sydney, Australia. We're about to open shop in Japan, and then our goal is to be in every AWS geographical region by the end of next year. Okay, if there is a specific region that you see here that is not available yet, that you're interested in, let us know, because we can let the business unit know, and we can expand there quicker if we have the demand for it. But our goal is by the end of next year, so hopefully by this time next year, we'll be in almost every single geographical region in the world that AWS operates from. We also have what we call a stretch cluster, right? So up until now, and the environment that you guys are going to use is basically a regular cluster. In your case, it's a one-node SDDC. Our minimum purchase today, if you want to use the service, is 3 nodes in a cluster, right? So if you want to buy the service, you can buy a minimum of 3 nodes. What you're using today is a one-node SDDC. You can certainly purchase that, but one-node SDDCs have a 30-day time limit. So what those 30 days means is on day 30, I either have to destroy that one node that I created, or I have to expand it into a bigger cluster, into a 3 or 4 or 5 node cluster, so that I can keep it running forever. You can't keep it running for more than 30 days. But we also have stretch clusters from VMware Cloud on AWS. I've been mentioning what a geographical region from an AWS perspective is. For those of you that don't know, and I apologize if those of you that are familiar with the AWS way of doing things, AWS has a geographical region. So for example, Northern Virginia and the East Coast of the United States, that's the geographical region. Within each geographical region, they have multiple availability zones. What an availability zone is basically, think of it as a separate data center where they have separate power grids, separate telecom communication links coming into each of those availability zones that are separate from each other. And the thought from an AWS perspective is, if availability zone A, for example, becomes unavailable, availability zone B is still there to operate, right? So we now have the capability of offering you what a stretch cluster in VMware Cloud on AWS that spans to a second availability zone. So if you don't select a stretch cluster when you're building your cluster is just going to be created on one availability zone, wherever that subnet was. But if you select a stretch cluster, in this example, I have a 6-node cluster. 3 of my nodes are in availability zone A, 3 of my nodes are in availability zone B. We have a witness node that basically is watching outside of these 2 zones to make sure that that primary zone, in this example A, is not going down. And if it goes down, then power everything up from availability zone B. And what's happening under the covers is that vSAN is replicating everything from zone A to zone B, right? So all of your data, as soon as it starts writing to disk on zone A, is being replicated directly into zone B. There's absolutely nothing that you can do, that you need to do. That witness node, in the unlikely event that availability zone A goes down, then that witness node is going to notice that zone A is going to go down, and all of your VMs will be powered up from zone B, okay? We also have this tool, Hybrid Cloud Extension, right? Hybrid Cloud Extension is great because it allows you to migrate and exit your environment in a very quick manner. Just to give you an example, we have a major university in the East Coast of the United States that migrated over 3,000 VMs in a period of 3 months, right? And HyperCloud Extension also allows you to abstract the infrastructure that you're running under the covers. So maybe you're running on a very old version of Vsphere and you want to vacate your data center. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to upgrade that version of Vsphere to a newer version and then do all the evacuation, right? That's almost the equivalent of you having a very old car and you're going to go to the dealership tomorrow to buy a new car and you're going to trade it in and you buy new wheels for it today. It just doesn't make sense, right? So if you don't want to do that, VMware HyperCloud Extension allows you to basically deploy an appliance on-prem, and it allows you to migrate VMs into the cloud, into VMware Cloud and AWS in 3 different ways. One is what we call bulk migration. Bulk migration allows you to replicate a VM without powering it off into the cloud, and you can do the switchover in 2 ways, and I'll explain what a switchover is. A switchover basically means the VM on premises shuts down, there's a last sync of the VM, and the VM in the cloud powers up. That process can take a few seconds, it could take a few minutes, depending on the size of the VM, depending on the bandwidth that you have from an internet perspective. That's one way of doing it. You can also do that switchover in 2 different ways. One way is, as soon as the machine finishes replicating, do the switchover, power my machine down, power it up in the cloud, or schedule it at some point in the future. So maybe you guys have some very strict change management procedures at your company, and you only allow certain times or days during the week where you can do that switchover. Maybe it's Saturdays at 2 a.m. So Saturday at 2 a.m. comes around, the machine's going to replicate all the way up to that point. 2 a.m. Saturday comes, machine on premises shuts down, there's a last sync, machine in the cloud powers up. That's one way of doing that, that migration. The second way is vMotion. We all know what vMotion is. I basically select it, I stretch a network over to the other side, my machine gets relocated immediately into the cloud and never loses its IP or its MAC address, and it never shut down, right? And we just now introduced also a 3rd option called Cloud Motion with Vsphere Replication. And what Cloud Motion does, it basically does the same process the bulk migration did, but instead of doing that switchover, it actually, that last piece, vMotion takes over and actually vMotions the machine live into the cloud. So you tell me, how's that different from vMotion? Is that you actually now have the capability of scheduling when the vMotion happens. Where today, if I only select vMotion, it's going to relocate it immediately, right? So now you have the ability to schedule when that vMotion is going to happen. And one thing I haven't mentioned about HyperCloud Extension is that it also has a built-in 1 acceleration appliance, so that it dedupes the traffic as it goes to the other side. So if I'm migrating 100 CentOS 6 VMs, the operating system part of each of those VMs is going to go across the wire once, because it will dedupe that traffic. Going to the other side, which makes it a lot more efficient and a lot faster to be able to migrate those workloads into the cloud. You can also leverage VMware Cloud and AWS for your DR environment, right? Site Recovery Manager, if you guys are familiar with SRM, it's basically the same exact product. You can literally replicate all your VMs from on-premise into the cloud, or perhaps you want to do it from the cloud to cloud, where you have your main VMware Cloud and AWS environment in London, let's say, and you want to replicate it to Frankfurt. So you can do that from a cloud to cloud perspective. And you can also utilize it, so perhaps you want to move all your production applications to the Frankfurt data center, to the Frankfurt AWS data center, but then you want to protect them back on-prem for some reason or another, you can also do that as well. So, I told you guys about the starter single host, which is basically what you guys are using in this environment. You're going to get 20% off for the first 3 months. So you can basically run a 1 node for 3 months, except every 30 days you would have to delete it and recreate it. But it's about $5.60 an hour, so it's relatively cheap. You can go to that URL, that short URL there. And we do support most international credit cards as well. So if you guys are interested in that, there is a scan code also in your lab manual that you guys can utilize about that. And again, if you're playing cloud credits, the keyword is connectivity. You're more than welcome to scan that. I'll leave it up for a little bit, or just write down the keyword. And from this point, I think that we're ready to start the lab, right?